Welcome to the Self-Care for the Creative podcast, where we talk about self-care strategies for creatives, empaths, and highly sensitive people. I'm your host, Stefani Fryzel, aka Dylan. I'm an artist, a songwriter, and an author. And today I have a very special guest, and we talk all things self-care along the creative journey. I'm so glad you're here. 'Cause I know I'm Dr. Terry Bacow is a well-known expert in cognitive behavioral therapy, an evidence-based therapy approach. Dr. Bacow is currently seeing clients in person as well as via telehealth in her private practice in New York City. She is uniquely interested in helping clients with transitional stages of life and is particularly passionate about parent mental health and helping moms and dads hold on to their sanity. Dr. Bacow also enjoys writing about stress and mental health and has been featured in Women's Health Magazine, Shape Magazine, Oprah Daily, and Vogue, as well as various blogs and podcasts. She is the author of Goodbye Anxiety, a guided journal for overcoming worry. Please welcome Dr. Terry Bacow.
Thank you for having me.
Yay, I'm super excited. I am really glad that you're on the show today because, as you know, this podcast is primarily for creatives, empaths, and highly sensitive people. And we deal with a lot of different things: depression, anxiety, like living the creative lifestyle, all of those things. So it's really nice to bring on a doctor, a specialist, somebody who really specializes in anxiety and those types of issues that a lot of us have to deal with and how to cope with them. So maybe we could just start with, maybe you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yes, thank you. So I am a psychologist. I'm in New York City. I have a private practice, and I'm also an author. And I did write a book about anxiety, Goodbye Anxiety, a guided journal for overcoming worry. This book is really for young people. It is for college students, young adults, teenagers, and it really focuses on concrete skills for managing and overcoming anxiety.
Amazing. I can't wait to dive into your book a little bit more because we all need the anxiety management skills for sure. So maybe give us a little rundown on, I know that you're an anxiety specialist and you're a cognitive behavioral therapist, right? So maybe for people like us who we're not in the doctor world, we don't know anything about the terminology, maybe give us a rundown on what is cognitive therapy? Behavioral therapy.
Absolutely. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. So when you think about going to therapy, I think folks have different ideas of what that involves. I think many of us think of it as talking. A CBT does have a talk component, but instead of focusing on the past, there's the stereotype, what did your mother do to you? Instead of thinking about the past or your dream, it's more present focused, action-oriented, and solution-focused. We really focus on what's happening in the here and now and how to solve problems. And this involves learning certain skills and certain tools. So maybe there might be a breathing exercise or an exercise where we examine thought patterns and challenge them, or another one where you do a behavioral experiment. So these are tools that people can use in the real world. So CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, is a little bit more didactic in that sense, that there's a little bit more teaching. But that doesn't mean that the client won't talk. It's still a talk relationship. It's just focused a little bit more on these tools.
Right. So it's the here, the now, the actions, and challenging certain behaviors, essentially. Kind of. Okay, cool. I saw something on your Instagram that I thought was so interesting that I just wanted to touch on real quickly. It was a text quote and it said the 3 components of an emotion. And I just wait, we need to talk about that on the podcast. That's super interesting. Could you give us a rundown? What are the 3 components of an emotion?
I'm so glad you found that one, because the 3-component model is the CBT model. That's what it is. At the foundation of CBT is the idea that any emotion, anxiety, anger, disgust, fear, any emotion has three parts: a thought, a feeling, and a behavior. What you think, what you feel, and what you do. And the reason we break an emotion down into these three pieces, number one, it's more manageable, and also because these three components are related. When we have, let's say, an anxious thought, we're going to have an anxious feeling, and then we're going to take some kind of action or inaction. And whenever you, let's say, avoid something or you overdo something, you're just going to solidify and reinforce the belief that you have about it. So we end up in this cycle or triangle between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And the way that we break the cycle, according to a CBT approach, would be to either change the thought or change the behavior in order to change the feeling.
That's so interesting because like most people really aren't thinking through this process whatsoever. They're just out there living their lives, not really paying attention to how their thoughts are creating feelings or vice versa. The feelings are creating thoughts and then it's then influencing the behaviors, like what you do next. I want to talk about panic attacks real quick, just because I've experienced panic attacks and my husband has a history of anxiety as well. He's a music producer. We first started dating, and to me, my impression of him was like this cool, calm, collected dude, right? You know, I've later realized that he was just like, oh, you know, like I have to take my medicine. I was like, oh, medicine for what? And he's like, oh, I have anxiety. You know, I'm on medication for anxiety. And I was like, wow, I had no idea that like you even struggled with that. And so it was kind of interesting that you never know what someone is actually dealing with and what that looks like for them, whether they choose medication or whether they don't choose medication. Totally up to the person who's experiencing that. But I remember it being a surprise for me, being like, wow, I had no idea. And then I saw he started weaning off his medication for a little bit, and then a big transition happened. He moved studios in New York, and then also his grandma passed away. So two big things happened. And then he started having panic attacks. And we were living together at this point. And I had never witnessed a panic attack until that moment. It was like the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. He had like a night panic attack where he woke up in the middle of the night and it was like, he was just like on the floor, totally disassociating with everything, full-blown panic attack. And as the person on the other end, like receiving this for the first time, you know, obviously I was like scared. I was like, what do I do? I was trying not to panic. I was like, okay, let's go for a walk. Let's talk. Like, I'm here. I'm okay. You're okay. Everything's okay. But I just would love for you to give us some breakdowns on like, what do you do for someone if you're there and you're witnessing someone experience that panic attack? Like, what's the best way to approach it? How can you help this person? And I would just love your perspective on that.
Great question. I actually spoke about this in an article recently where I really broke down some tips. I think the first thing to do is to validate, Well, let me take a step back. I think the first thing to do is to not freak out yourself, because it can be scary to see someone that you love, that you care about, who's kind of melting down, essentially. So you yourself, you want to compose yourself and really put on your best poker face. Calm yourself down, tell yourself the person is just fine, they're going to be fine. And then the next step would be to validate. And what I mean by that is to let them know that it looks like they're having anxiety and that you're there for them, that it's going to be okay, that it's okay to have these feelings. The last thing you want to do is this is what not to do, is to shame them or to scold them or to judge them. That's the absolute opposite. That you want to instead validate, support. And I think part of that support is asking them what you can do that would be helpful, to not make assumptions about that. So some people do want to be touched, other people don't. It depends on how severe the panic attack is. So you could say, would it be helpful if I touch you right now? Would it be helpful if we go outside? Kind of offer suggestions, offer support. And if you happen to have information that you can give them, it would be even better. So I think that it's a little bit of a tall order to ask a layperson to know what a psychologist knows. But one thing that I think would be good for your audience to know is that panic attacks are temporary. It's simply the fight or flight system in overdrive. They're not dangerous. It doesn't mean that anything is wrong. And so I think it's good for us, if we have that information, to tell our loved ones the same information, to kind of educate them a little bit, and then offer support, but also ask what kind of support they need.
Right. It's so good that you pointed that out, because what you may think could be helpful to somebody may not be helpful to that person to do in that moment. So it's important to ask them what would be helpful and make suggestions, but kind of follow their lead a little bit, So such good advice. I remember thinking to myself, I was like, Steph, don't freak out. He's already freaking out. Don't freak out. Like he needs you to be calm right now and have to ground him. And I hadn't experienced a panic attack at that point just yet myself. It wasn't until years later that I also started experiencing panic attacks, and it's weird. It's such a weird experience. And mine came in the form of I think I was out shopping one day, and I was definitely stressed about something in my life. And my brain started to disconnect from reality. And I started to feel really lightheaded, and, my chest was beating, and, and then it was like a well up of tears. I just had to cry. And I was like, what is wrong with me? What is happening? What is wrong with me? And I remember I told Brian, I was like, I have to go sit in the car and just I think I just need to cry. So you mentioned something earlier on about it's just your flight or fight response in overdrive. So can you maybe touch on a little bit about what those things could be? What is it that could drive your fight or flight, kind of through the roof?
Absolutely. So the first thing that I think is important to point out is that anxiety is adaptive. It's designed to keep us safe. If you think of evolution, if there is a tiger or lion in front of you, you best get out of the way. So we all have anxiety. Some of us, genetically speaking, have more anxiety than others just because it runs in family. And we have maybe more sensitive nervous system than a fight or flight system that's a little bit more active. So for those folks, they have something called anxiety sensitivity, where when we feel sensations of anxiety in our bodies, they can feel bigger. And sometimes, if you don't know, if you've never had a panic attack and you don't know what's going on, if you have a little bit of some kind of sensation, which our nervous system just normally produces, and you ask yourself, what is this? What is going on? Why is my heart pounding? Why do I feel dizzy? Then you might feel even more anxious, and that sensation might become bigger. So I always tell my client to recognize that anxiety is a feeling, that the fight or flight system is simply releasing some chemicals, and that if you catastrophize, if you freak out that you're having these sensations, ironically, those sensations will become stronger and bigger. And that's how a panic attack gets triggered. So the best thing to do is to just recognize that these are simply sensations that our bodies produce from time to time, that if you're prone to anxiety, you'll be more likely to have them. I almost tell my clients, just keep walking, just almost ignore it. Because if you don't react, then you're giving the body a signal that it's okay, it's not dangerous, and then you slowly begin to calm down.
Right. Yeah, no, totally. It's so interesting that you mentioned earlier about how people who are highly sensitive, which is kind of what I want to talk about next, is that, you could be not an empath or a highly sensitive person and experience a panic attack. But you could also be a highly sensitive person and experience a panic attack where everything is just on 100, right? So maybe you could speak to just the differences between someone who's not quote unquote highly sensitive versus someone who is highly sensitive. And, what should that person know in terms of managing their anxiety?
Sure. So when we think about highly sensitive, there's a lot of components to that. I think there's also misconception, but I think people who are highly sensitive experience emotion more frequently and more intensely than those who aren't. So it's important to know that about yourself and to not judge it, because when we judge our emotions and reject them and suppress them, they have a rebound effect. They get even more intense. So I always tell my clients, give yourself permission to feel your feelings. It's okay to have them. I believe the highly sensitive people also are more sensitive, not just to emotion, but sensory experiences like noises, textures, smells, crowds. They got overstimulated and overwhelmed, maybe a little bit more easily. That's why highly sensitive and anxiety could go hand in hand. If you're sensitive to overstimulation, you're going to feel more anxious.
Right, of course, because they're already prone to overwhelm in chaotic scenes, certain smells, lights, sounds, all of those things. So if you're already sensitive in that environment, anything else, like any sort of trigger could be just more intense. Yeah. So let's talk about your book real quick called Goodbye Anxiety. And maybe you could give us a rundown of like what's in the book and who it's for and maybe some of your favorite tips.
Sure. So this is a book that's based on CBT, which is the approach that I mentioned a little while ago, as well as give people tools that they can easily use. So the book is fun, I have to say. I think it is not a difficult book to read at all. It's colorful to look at. It's short. Decided there's actually over 100 writing prompts and exercises in the book, and there's many cultural references. So really what I'm trying to do is make CBT accessible and enjoyable. One other thing about the book is it has 3 sections. There are journal prompts so that you can dump out your worries. There's a whole section on thinking traps and how to challenge them.
Thinking traps. You caught my attention on thinking traps. Can we talk about what is a thinking trap and how do you challenge the thinking trap? Can you give us an example?
Great question. So when we're anxious, anxiety, as I mentioned, comes from thoughts, which might sound really obvious. But many of us, we're just sort of living our lives. We have a stream of consciousness, so we're not thinking about our thoughts. But it's the stories that we tell ourselves and the narratives that lead to anxiety. If you catastrophize something, for example, if you say to yourself, this is terrible, awful, this is a disaster, then you're going to feel really worked up about it. So a thinking trap is there's many different types of them. Catastrophizing is one. Magnifying, fortune telling, jumping to conclusion, should statements. That's another one.
Okay.
Guilty thinking. All of these traps describe certain, like I said, patterns of anxious thinking where we're overreacting, quite honestly, and that we need to counter those with logic. So, for example, I might say to a client, has it ever happened to you before when you were in the same situation? How did you handle it? Was it as bad as you thought it was going to be? Or do you have any evidence for the prediction that you're making? Do you know for sure this person's mad at you? What evidence do you have? Is somebody's facial expression enough evidence to know that someone is upset with you? So these are some of these techniques that we use with identifying and challenging thinking traps.
Wow, this is changing my life right now. I'm like, well, I have to go identify what my thinking traps are and I have to challenge them because as humans, I feel like we want to be right, like we want to be right about what we're thinking and be like, oh, well, I'm thinking this thought. Well, it must be true then. So our habits can tend to want to sort of prove ourselves right, even though the thinking trap is not necessarily true. So just take a second to have an identifying moment of like, is this thought valid? Like, is there proof? Is there evidence? Is this true at all? And kind of, yeah, like you said, it challenged the thought. So your book has lots of prompts in it, which I love. My book also has prompts in it too, because I think that's just the best part is like, making the person sit down and really think through their own experience so that they can kind of mirror back what's going on, So would you say like journal prompts and writing in general, just to make space for your thoughts and feelings, is like, that's a go-to tip for anyone? Like, would you suggest that?
Absolutely. And I think many of us just don't realize how the interpretations we're making influence our mood. So that's why whenever someone's in a mood, I encourage them to ask themselves, what am I telling myself right now? What is going through my mind? When we worry about maybe 7 different things. So that I always say, what is trending? Out of all the worries you have, what are the ones that are trending? What's your really specific concern? Because once we can identify a specific concern, for example, I'm worried that so-and-so isn't going to like me for this reason, then we can more powerfully examine that. But in order to do that, you really need to first identify what you're saying to yourself.
Right. It makes me think of something that I bring up in my book. Again, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a doctor, and I make that very clear in my book. But something that I do in my book is like, challenging a mindset, and identifying a specific mindset, a self-limiting belief, right? Let's just say, you think you suck at handling money or whatever that is. In the exercise, I'm like, okay, can you write the complete opposite of it? And like, tell that to yourself like over and over and over and over again, because we don't realize the narratives, like you said, that we're constantly telling ourselves in our subconscious. And it's until you actually sit down and identify the self-limiting ones and challenge those that can make a difference in your life. I'm curious to see if you have noticed any particular trends or statistics around anxiety right now in terms of young people or creative people or highly sensitive people. I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to what are the current like trends and statistics that are like, this is the situation.
Sure. So the first thing that I think would be useful to share is that anxiety is incredibly prevalent among everyone. About 40 million Americans experience problematic clinical levels of anxiety, and about 1/3 of teenagers. So it's really, in terms of what I'm seeing more prevalence amongst all of us, certainly amongst empaths and highly sensitive folks, because those folks are really focused not just on themselves and their own internal state, but they're really aware of other people and their feelings. They're really attuned to others' emotion. And it could be a lot to take on to kind of deal with what's going on amongst yourself, but also to be people-pleasing and to really be concerned about others and their emotion. That's a lot. That's a real burden. So that's why I think self-care and anxiety management is even more important. The good news is that I feel that our culture has been more accepting of mental health. The stigma has gone down. People can be more open about their anxiety in the same way your husband was when you were dating. And we can talk about it more openly. And I think that's another reason we're seeing higher rates of it, is that folks are being more forthcoming and sharing their mental health challenges, which is not a bad thing. It's actually a positive.
Totally. You brought up such an important piece that, I was even curious about just in therapy in general, because like you said, like amongst empaths and highly sensitive people, they are very concerned about other people's emotions. They may have a habit of people pleasing, and they end up taking on more stuff that isn't even theirs. And I wonder if, do you think that it's as known as it should be amongst therapists and doctors and, people who prescribe medication? Like, do you think that that's factored in to, patients and clients when they show up to therapy? Because that is a big piece of like our mental health equation. If you're an empath or a highly sensitive person, how you can manage that stress. Like, do you think the awareness around empaths and HSPs is as high as it should be?
Oh, yes. And I'm always telling my clients to focus more on themselves as opposed to others. We have enough going on that we don't need to take on the problem of all of our friends and family members.
Right. Yeah. Are you able to tell, generally speaking, whether or not your client is an empath or an HSP, or is there like a process that you go through to just identify that with a client?
I believe so. I mean, I've been doing this for over 20 years, so I think that I've really been able to pick up what's going on with someone, what their diagnosis is. If they're more sensitive than the average person, I think knowing their diagnosis can really inform my understanding. For example, if you have neurodiversity, if you have ADHD, for example, that's going to really affect your emotion regulation and your rejection sensitivity. So, yes, I believe I can tell.
I discovered the empath HSP thing in my therapist's office. Like I had no idea what it was. Like I didn't know until I was 30, and I went in and I was just going to my, therapist, and I was, taking on everyone's problems, and I was stressed out. And then one day my therapist was like, "Have you ever heard of empaths or highly sensitive people?" And I was like, "No, what is that?" And yeah, it's just crazy that I never knew about it. And to me, it was still pretty new. And, now it's a little bit more talked about and the awareness is starting to come around. But, I still consider myself I still have lots to learn, but I've done lots of reading and stuff. But for my entire life, for 30 years, I had no clue that was even a factor to my mental health. And it's huge. It's a huge factor. To wrap this up, maybe you could leave us with, maybe give us your number one tool for anxiety management.
Sure. So I might have to do two really quickly.
Okay, yeah, give us more. Yeah, I'm down. Let's go. Let's give us 3. We need it.
Okay. So the first that is easy and concrete and it really can't be understated. It's breathing. If you can do it anytime, anywhere, you can't leave your breath at home. Take a deep cleansing breath. What that's going to do is going to bring oxygen to your nervous system and instantly calm it down. So I just have to mention breathing as a no-brainer and a kind of sure thing. And then beyond that, one more psychological tool is self-compassion. We're so very hard on ourselves all the time. And I think the culture we're in, we put even so much more pressure on ourselves. So I'm always encouraging folks to be kind to themselves, to not be as hard on themselves. It's okay to make mistakes. Self-compassion really does help anxiety because of that negative thinking pattern that we're in. If we could just tell ourselves, it's okay, next time will go better, you really will feel less anxious. So that's the last piece I wanted to share.
Self-compassion, that's such a big one because we're not prone to choose that. We're not really this is it's not a habit that's even really taught, right? So, but you're right, the self-compassion piece, if you can be kind to yourself, speak well to yourself and validate your experience and encourage yourself and be kind, that really goes a long way with anxiety. So thank you so much. This was such a great conversation. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today. Thank you so much. 'Cause I know I'm right. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. For more self-care strategies, check out my book, Self-Care for the Creative. And if you're an up-and-coming artist, songwriter, or music producer, come join us at the Songwriter Series. It's an online platform that offers one-to-one music mentorship from hit songwriters. I also curate a quarterly music industry panel to help people break into the music industry and get in the mix. For more info on all my events, visit stefanifryzel.com or just email me at info@stefanifryzel.com. I'm on all social media platforms and I will leave all those links and handles in the show notes, so check that out. If you're loving the podcast, please share, subscribe, share it with a friend. Your support is super appreciated. And don't forget, self-care is always within reach and your greatest masterpiece will always be you.